Let's get more now on the release of Julian Assange. I'm joined by Deutsche Welle correspondent Arthur Sullivan in Berlin. Arthur, g'day. So how have European leaders reacted to the plea deal struck with Julian Assange?
Well, here's the thing. Somewhat curiously, there's been almost no public comment from either the EU or the leaders of different European countries since this plea deal was struck earlier this week. Now, in some ways, you might say that is surprising, given how prominent the story of Assange and WikiLeaks has been in Europe and in many countries for well over a decade now. Now, in other ways, it's perhaps not hugely surprising, given that Assange's fiercest critics have typically been governments, obviously the US, but also some of its European allies, who have regularly accused him of being reckless with the leaking of sensitive material. Now, one of the few public reactions from Europe that we do have is from Germany's Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, who's a member of the Green Party. She said Assange's case had, quote, moved people all over the world and had been discussed emotionally. So that's a relatively muted, but nonetheless positive reaction. And generally, Assange's case has received more sympathy from left-wing politicians in Europe down the years, and Baerbock's sentiments are similar to those of Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who earlier this year said he hoped the UK would protect Assange from extradition to the US.
So how supportive has the EU generally been of Julian Assange over the years?
Well, the EU has been quite regularly criticised by Assange's supporters for not doing enough to lobby for his case. And despite the fact that it was originally obviously Swedish prosecutors who first sought Assange's arrest over sex crime allegations, an investigation which of course was dropped eventually, and then the UK, where Assange was held for so long, both European countries, despite that fact, the case has typically been seen as a US one, and EU leaders have often said that when asked about it and appeared reluctant to get involved. Now, left-wing European politicians, as I said, including members of the European Parliament, they have been vocal supporters of Assange over the years. They regularly brought attention to his case, and 2 years ago he was nominated for the Parliament's Human Rights Prize, the Sakharov Prize, and that requires quite a lot of support. 40 MEPs had to support that nomination. Now, he didn't win it. Ukrainian President Zelensky won it that year, but the fact that he was nominated did show he has substantial support on the European left. And that same year, during elections in France, or an election campaign, French leftist politician Jean-Luc Mélenchon said that he would offer Assange French citizenship if he was to win the election. Again, it's a sign of how support for Assange in Europe does tend to be tied to a political affiliation.
And how supportive is the EU of whistleblowers generally?
Well, the EU certainly likes to see itself as a place where press freedom thrives and a place where whistleblowers are protected. Now, for decades, whistleblowers had not much legal protection in Europe, but 5 years ago, the EU introduced something called the Whistleblowing Directive. That was a series of laws that it said member states had to implement in order to build channels for whistleblowers and also protect them from possible retaliation. So those laws affect companies that have more than 50 employees, various public sector institutions, lots of different types of authorities. But many countries, including Germany, have been quite slow in implementing these laws and have been accused of introducing some laws which don't even meet the standards of that directive. So the sense endures that lots of governments in Europe, while they talk a good game on whistleblowing, they're not necessarily ultimately as supportive as they could be. Maybe not a huge surprise, given that it is often governments that people want to blow the whistle on.
Okay, Arthur Sullivan there in Berlin. Time now for finance. Here's Alicia Barry.